We talked about David Gauke before of the Gawkward Squad and why and who he is. That he is sort of one of these sensible conservatives who really need to take control back of the Conservative Party to at least bring it back to normality. Of course, I don't 100% agree with David Gauke. We're sort of very different sides of the political spectrum, both him and I, but I do recognize the need for at least a sane and sensible Conservative Party, at least to be in opposition. This is why, at least, by the time, at least the next election, the Liberal Democrats may become the main party of opposition, which will, again, I think, be very good. But if the Conservative Party is to ever really regain any type of its sense or anything like that, then people like David Gauke, who currently are treated as like the lone voice in the wind, this political outcast, when in a couple of years' time, I think this guy is going to be like, oh, Gauke was right all along. And bear in mind, we've covered him before. We've seen his stuff, what he's been saying. He's 100% right. He calls out why the Conservatives lost, where the big defeats were. While he doesn't go too deep into Conservative policy and why they lost in that policy end, he does at least recognize that there was a lot of wrong in the Conservative policy that will have turned voters off and made life worse for a lot of people. But right now, he is one of the only few active out there Conservatives actively saying the direction that this party is going is wrong, and he is out there consistently saying that thing again and again and again. And I do believe probably maybe in a long time at least, people will probably turn around and go, yeah, he was right all this time. And today, I think the message he's got, which is a lot of the UK Conservatives really need to learn, is that we should have absolutely nothing to do with Donald Trump. And so, as always, before we get on into this, please do remember to have a look at the Patreon page, the Buy Me Coffee link, the YouTube thank you button, the Pony Club down below as well. And of course, as always, you can leave me a super thanks too. So thank you very much to everyone who does help support the channel that way. And of course, you can just by clicking the like and share button as well. So as always, let's crack on then into this. This comes from Conservative Home. And of course, and as I've said before, Conservative Home, all the comments pretty much against David Gauke because they hate him. They hate the fact that he is, generally telling the truth in a lot of these areas. They absolutely despise David Gauke. But there you go. It's just where the current Conservative Party is at the moment, of someone who actually, talks a lot of sense and is a sane, rational conservative, just isn't welcome in the current iteration of the Conservative Party. And it's probably going to get much worse when Kimmy Badenoch wins as well. So, this is what we begin. So, should Conservatives vote for Donald Trump? This is the topic of the debate that I'm going to have with Tim Montgomery, founder of this website, tonight, which is going to be available to watch online later tonight or attend in person if you happen to be in London. My position is no. That will be very interesting to watch. Maybe we'll watch that on Wednesday and see what it turns out like. So, presumably, of course, someone will post in the comments below to that effect that I am not qualified to speak as a conservative. But at least on this issue, my views are aligned with the majority of conservative voters. And bear in mind, he got that right. He got that absolutely right. Most people, or at least the current membership of the Conservative Party, would consider someone like David Gauke, who, again, I would definitely say he's a conservative. They would never say he's a conservative in a month of Sundays. But he continues. So according to YouGov, at least 55% of conservatives do want Kamala Harris to win, where only 27% want a Trump victory. Incidentally, on this test, with its attitudes to the anti-immigration riots of the summer, conservative voters are a lot closer aligned to the Labour and Liberal Democrats than they are to Reform voters. To put it another way, Reform voters have a very set of views that are very different to those of the vast majority of the British public, including the majority of Tories. But that's perhaps a column for another day. And again, David Gauke pointing it out. Actually, when you look at what Reform voters actually want versus what the Conservative voters, would want, and of course, the vast majority of the rest of the British public, very different. How can you win back, as we've kept on saying, if you're going to do this massive tilt to the right, which Kimmy Badenoch will absolutely do, how then does this win over the rest of the British voting public? That voting bloc, which the real lesson the Conservatives should have learned from this last election, is that voting bloc that they've relied on for years is no longer reliable enough. First of all, the vote split, so you're now competing with an ever-decreasing voting bloc. And meanwhile, as we keep on saying, the centrist bloc has only gotten bigger over the past 10 years, going from 30% to 35%. The left and right have not grown. Only the center has grown. So, again, David Gauke telling the hard truth that the Tories should be listening to, should be paying attention to, but again, he's not being listened to. So, back to this. So, as Tim has now already set out his case elsewhere, it is only fair that I surrender any element of surprise in my arguments. Of course, at this evening's debate, these points will be accompanied now by my brilliant rhetorical flourishes, so do not least put this article off from you attending. But here are 3 broad objections to Trump. First, let us take policy. So, from a UK perspective, Trump has 2 policies which are very consequential and both objectionable. He favors tariffs, not just on imports from China, where he proposes a 60% tariff, but on everyone with a 10% tariff, including the UK. And we've seen this. Those tariffs that he wants to put on China, when you all had them up, equate to something like 200%. Like, that would be insane on China. And then, of course, he's going to put a 10% tariff on, everyone else. So if Trump wins, not only is there going to be a massive potential trade war with China, which is going to massively affect the world, massively so, economically, but putting a 10% tariff on everyone else because, why not, according to Trump, that's going to hurt everyone as well. So this is, of course, truly stupid, idiotic policy from a US perspective, and it runs the risk of now provoking a trade war, which could have, as I said, have devastating impact now on the world. It has been reported that the British officials have been at least very negative impact, even greater than Brexit. So this is something else. We made an argument during the point of the Brexit referendum that if we are out of the EU, we are out of the single market, we're going to be very, very susceptible to world and international shocks and things like this happening. So, yeah, it is going to have a bigger negative effect than Brexit. Perhaps, of course, a point I should refrain from making to this particular audience. Again, yeah, good point on that one. Yeah, very true. When you're in a debate, know your audience. Trump also wants to end support for Ukraine. This, I would be actually very interested in hearing what the rebuttal is from the other side of this. I'd be very interested in seeing what he says in this. But he continues. Anyway, he says he will end the war immediately, but the only lever he has is to actually, of course, withdraw support from Ukraine and hope that this now forces them to make concessions. Either Ukraine's other allies, such as the UK, will now have to fill the breach, and it would be very costly, and I can imagine how Trump would, of course, react to that, or even acquiesce to the surrender of Ukrainian sovereign territory to Putin, which, again, you don't want to happen. And that's another thing as well. If we Europeans step up, after, let's say Trump wins, pull support from Ukraine, Europeans step up to fill that breach, what then does Trump do? Does Trump punish the UK? Does he punish Germany more for providing more arms and support? Trump is known to be very, very vindictive. Very, very vindictive on these types of things. And he might see it as, well, I could have ended this war, but because of the UK and the rest of Europe, they're the ones who are, quote, continuing this war, not us. He could be very, very vindictive. That 10% tariff could suddenly become a 20% tariff. So, again, be very, very careful of that. We have to be. And there is, of course, now a stand of conservatism that is, of course, protectionist and isolationist. But for any admirer, of course, Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, to go along with any of these policies is extraordinary. Trump does represent a repudiation of all their values on free trade and internationalism. And again, it goes to show you how the Republican Party has changed. Where it once was the party of Reagan, it has now become the party of Trump. And those policies that Reagan championed and sort of said have now fundamentally changed. It just goes to show you how changed the party has been on this. So, remarkably, of course, the risk of Trump to now geopolitical and economic security is only now the third strongest argument against him. Next, we come to character. Politicians, of course, human beings and have their flaws, but has there ever been a contender for high office whose personality flaws were so objective and obvious? Trump is dishonest, divisive, he's coarse, self-pitying, ignorant, inconsequentialist, he's intemperate. He now courts concluded that he has now committed rape. He has even boasted about grabbing pussies. He is even a grifter. He uses his political frame to now promote his own tacky merchandise. Not only does he lack any ethos for public service, but he disrespects those who do, labeling them as POWs, now as suckers. Age has not mellowed him out. It has immediately now made him even more unpredictable and incoherent. So, what would that say about a society that elected him as leader? And what example would that set to younger people if the embodiment of power and success is a figure such as Trump? Again, very true. From a moralistic standpoint, Trump has no legal argument, which is the insane view where you think so many figures on the religious right view him as like this saint, godlike figure, but moralistically, absolutely not. Then, of course, we jump now to the third, and in my view, the most overwhelming argument against Trump. His, of course, behavior on the 2020 presidential election, including on the 6th of January 2021. It is unfortunate that it has not yet been brought to trial, but this story is, of course, familiar. Following his defeat, he refused to accept the election result, attempting now to force officials in Georgia to change the results and bring in a series of legal claims, all of which were dismissed. On the 6th of January, the date the Congress was due to certify the election result, he called on his vice president, Mike Pence, to refuse to certify the result. Trump gathered his supporters at a rally and now urged them to convene on the Capitol building. And it concluded his speech at just gone 1:10 by saying, we fight like hell. If we don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. 35 minutes later, and his supporters then overwhelmed the police and forced their way into the Capitol building. Within minutes, senators, members of Congress, and the vice president were then forced to hide, fearful for their lives. With violent protesters in the building, Trump tweeted then further criticism of Pence. And that is still shocking that you do have senators and people for Congress who are Republicans who were there fearing for their lives, who are now having to bend the knee to Trump because that's how their party has become. The only person we have seen willing to stand up to Trump is the former governor of New Jersey. Can't remember his name now. And of course, Nikki Haley, as we saw in the recent elections, the recent primaries. So they are very, very true, the only open ones. But even Nikki Haley has had to bend the knee. So that has only left really one guy really opening support. 1 second, I'm just going to have to remember his name. That's it, I've remembered it now. Chris Christie. Yeah. So there was, again, another guy who's been the only Republican, I think still the only open Republican still actively, at least as far as I'm aware, unless he too has bent the knee, I'm not too sure, that keeps on continuing to talk out about Trump, calling him a loser, calling him, out for what he is. I think if Trump loses this election, I think you're going to see him be very, very much vindicated for a lot of the things he was saying, especially during the primary stuff. But we'll see what happens if that, should that come to pass again. Fingers crossed. So it was not until, of course, 13 hours that Trump then tweeted again to call for the people to now remain peaceful. And then again, not until later, he called for the protesters to go home. Despite many appeals to call off the mob, Trump had refused to lift a finger for over 88 minutes after the violence now storming of the Capitol building. And he has shown absolutely no remorse for the events of that day. On the evening itself, he called the protesters now great patriots, and if elected, he is now committed now to pardoning all those who were convicted of criminal offences. Not, of course, just last week, his defendants he defended his position by trying to say the others had guns, but we didn't have guns. Let us be clear as to his meaning. When he refers to the others, he means the Capitol Police. And when he says we, he means, of course, an insurrectionist mob. And of course, that isn't true either. There is lots of evidence that people in the crowd, those insurrectionist mob, had guns. So he sought, of course, to prevent the peaceful transfer of power by inciting a riot. Surely this behavior is now beyond any other consideration, disqualifies him from support, at least for conservatives in particular, who are now supposed to believe in respecting institutions, the rule of law, and the maintenance of order. Trump's behavior on that day should put him very beyond the pale, and it should be. The Republicans should have taken that moment to absolutely shed everything about Donald Trump. You know, Liz Cheney went in that direction, and she has been absolutely vilified for it. But, you know, good on her for standing her ground and saying, you know, what Trump did as a Republican was well beyond the pale. You know, good for her for saying what she did. You know, don't agree with any of the other policies, but hey, she stood her ground and was willing to lead a lot of this stuff where other Republicans were just too scared of Trump to do anything about him. So anyway, Gauke continues. Kamala Harris may not be the most impressive presidential candidate of modern times. Again, I think that's completely false. I think she's actually going to be quite a good president. She's got quite a good track record. But Gauke continues. I do confess myself not being particularly impressed myself, but she has now a greater respect for the U.S. Constitution than Trump could ever have. There is, of course, much about her economic policy, of which anyone of a free market disposition would find troubling. But she will not condemn the world to a devastating trade war. She will be a much better ally to Ukraine and the West as a whole than Trump. Again, very, very true. And we've talked about that many, many times. What would happen if Trump won? There would be a lot of potential trouble spots, which could become a lot hotter if Trump becomes president. She clearly, of course, does have professional weaknesses, but she does seem very devoid of the malevolence, at least of her opponent. There is, of course, nothing about her personality or even agenda that justifies a vote for this Republican candidate. The GOP has been transformed by Trump. It is not the party of Reagan, the Bushes, John McCain, or even Mitt Romney. It may never be again. But for the better forms of conservatism to succeed, the worst form of conservatism, if Trumpism does continue in any kind of conservatism, must be defeated. Conservatives should not support him. Again, couldn't agree more. I'll be very interested to see what that debate's like. Like I say, maybe we'll go over it on Monday. Not Monday, on Wednesday evening, because I think it'd be very interesting to watch. But yeah, we'll see what happens. We'll definitely see what happens from this point of view. But yeah, I agree with David Gauke, and as I've said before, probably the only sensible, rational conservative left on a lot of fronts. That's for sure. So, as always, let me know what you think down below. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.